The House Committee on Election Integrity will come to order. Will the clerk please take the attendance?
Chair Smith.
Present.
Representatives Fox.
Likewise.
Outman. Alexander.
Here.
Hoadley.
Here.
Pavlo.
Here.
Wooden. Colzar.
Here.
Song. Present. Madam Chair, you do have a quorum.
Representative Hoadley moves to adopt the minutes from the June 3rd meeting. There being no objection, the motion prevails by unanimous consent. Today, welcome. Today the committee will be hearing testimony from Mr. Trent England and Jason Snead, who will be speaking to the concerns related to ranked choice voting here in Michigan. Welcome, Mr. England and Mr. Snead. You may, thank you for coming. You may come up to the table and begin when you are ready. There is a microphone button there to just use too, please.
Well, thank you, Representative Smith and members of the committee. It's a pleasure to be with you today. My name is Jason Snead. I am the Executive Director of the Honest Elections Project. We are a nonprofit organization which is dedicated to defending every American's right to vote in free and fair elections. That's part of the reason why we have been so focused over the last few years on ranked choice voting. This has been a movement that I think it's fair to say has really swept the nation's attention. And we have been heavily engaged all across the country pushing back on this spread of ranked choice voting because it really does fundamentally jeopardize free and fair elections, particularly when it comes to voter confidence in the election system and to the transparency and accountability that voters expect. And I'm very glad to say that as of right now, over the last 3 years, we have seen 17 states ban ranked choice voting. And last year in November, 6 states rejected ranked choice voting ballot measures by wide bipartisan margins. So while we have 2 states that are using ranked choice voting, Maine and Alaska, which incidentally are 2 of the smallest states in the country by population, we have seen an overwhelming and again a bipartisan rejection of ranked choice voting. And I think that speaks to how common sense it is to say no to this program. We've got a slide deck here, and I thought that the best place to begin when it comes to an explanation of RCV is to explain the mechanics of this process, because it truly is a fundamentally different type of election. You'll see here on the screen, this is a fairly standard sample ballot. It happens to be from the state of Virginia, but I think most of us would probably instantly recognize this. This is the way that most Americans vote, and this is the way that most Americans have historically voted, at least for the last 100+ years. You've got a series of races, you've got a series of candidates, voters pick one, they fill that in, and then they move on to the next election. With ranked choice voting, though, this very straightforward ballot is transformed into something that looks more like this. You do have, again, races with multiple candidates, but now instead of picking your person, you are asked to rank multiple candidates in every race, and then through a process of elimination, the winner is computed basically by eliminating poor performing candidates and redistributing ballots to each voter's next highest pick. Now, that's a mouthful for sure, so I thought that we could continue with the theme of visual aids and walk you through a hypothetical voting experience. This was an actual sample ballot that was prepared in the state of Alaska in 2022 when that state first began using ranked choice voting. The candidates are made up, but the process is essentially the same. And so what you would do as the voters, you would be examining all of the candidates running in every race. And it's important to note again that while this is an example of what a voting experience would be like in a single race, as you know, there are very often 10, 15, or 20 different races, so you would be doing this multiple times every time. Voters would study each of these candidates and then decide how to rank them first, second, third, and fourth. So in this case, once you go through this process and you learn everything there is to know about these candidates and you decide who you're going to vote for in first, you mark that, then you mark second, then you mark third, and so on. Now, ranked choice voting, its primary objective, or at least its claimed objective, is to deliver candidates that win a majority of the support within their voting constituencies. So what you do is you gather up all of the ballots and you run a tabulation. It has to be a central tabulation. But you run the tabulation. If no candidate gets over 50% of the first place vote, then you begin that series of elimination rounds that I mentioned. So you identify the candidate who got the fewest first place votes, eliminate that candidate, and then anyone who voted for him or her has their ballot shifted to their next highest pick. So again, in this hypothetical, let's say that you run those numbers and no one has a clear majority, so you begin that elimination round, and the person that you attempted to vote for in first is the first eliminated candidate. So now your ballot is shifted to your second choice, and they rerun the numbers. And again, for the sake of the hypothetical, we have no clear winner, so you run that again. Your second place choice has also been eliminated as the candidate with the fewest remaining votes, and so now your vote is shifted to your third place pick, and because it's a head-to-head match, there's now going to be a winner with a majority. So you tried to vote for two other people before your third place pick, but your vote is actually recorded for your third place choice. That is the process in a nutshell for ranked choice voting. And again, this is something that would be done a dozen or more times every time you're voting if you used ranked choice voting for state, federal, and local offices. Now, one reasonable question to ask is what happens if you have a race for any particular office, and as is wont to happen, there are a number of candidates that you don't support. No matter what party they are, you don't want to risk your vote getting shifted to your third place pick and wind up voting for somebody that you actually oppose. So what happens if, say, as again, most Americans might want to do, you only vote for several of the candidates? In this case, you only want to vote for your top two. Well, as we saw, those two candidates were eliminated before we had a winner declared. In this circumstance, this is called ballot exhaustion. That means that you've run out of choices before we get to a winner, so your ballot is actually eliminated. And not just eliminated in terms of what I call the numerator of the voting equation, votes cast for a candidate divided by the total votes cast in the election. It's actually eliminated from the denominator as well. So it's an interesting quirk with a ranked choice system. Every time you run this round of elimination, it looks like fewer and fewer people voted. And that's mathematically necessary to deliver what they call the majority result, because if you're not getting rid of those ballots in the denominator, there's no way to guarantee that you can actually have a majority winner. This is a fundamental flaw with ranked choice voting. And as I said, there are in any given election sometimes hundreds, sometimes thousands or more ballots that are eliminated and are thrown out. Now that is a substantial issue. But there are numerous process issues with ranked choice voting as well, and I'd like to take a few minutes to walk through some of those. The bottom line is that it is extraordinarily difficult to administer a ranked choice election, particularly when you're talking about running it at a statewide level. Again, I think it is notable that right now, ranked choice voting is used primarily at the city level for municipal elections and only in 2 states, which happen to be some of the smallest states by population. That's, I think, a very important thing to note. But in terms of the difficulty of administering elections, one of the first things that you lose with ranked choice voting is any ability to get election night reporting. That's because it's necessary to have all ballots in hand and counted before you can even begin the rounds of ranked choice tabulation, because you're no longer reporting just one number at the end, the total votes that a candidate gets. Now you have to go through a process of elimination, and the order of elimination matters. And one of the things you'll see in a slide in a moment is that because you are expanding the field of candidates, you're actually basically compressing the early vote totals. So now you're more likely to have very narrow races in the first round, so it's very important to get every ballot in. That means late ballots, if there are ballots that are involved in litigation, you have to wait for before you can actually run the ranked choice tabulation. Neither Maine nor Alaska does election night reporting, and actually today in New York City we have the ranked choice primary in the Democratic mayoral campaign. The New York Board of Elections will not run the first round of ranked choice tabulation for 1 week. And thereafter, they will report weekly, according to the Board of Elections, the results until the election is certified. So this is an extensive process, and there is essentially no way to deliver prompt results. Tabulation itself is extremely difficult with ranked choice voting. That is made even more so by the fact that in states like Michigan, where you have multiple voting system vendors, you have to centrally tabulate the ballots in some way for anything larger than a municipal election. So any election that spans multiple jurisdictions, now you're getting data reported from different vendors. And one of the things that we've seen is that all of the major vendors, HART, ES&S, Dominion, they all report through proprietary software. So it's difficult to actually get all of the vote totals aggregated. So you either have to solve that problem or you have to transport the ballots to a central location for tabulation, which of course risks further delays and complexity. Recounts are a difficult challenge with ranked choice voting because now you're not just recounting one election. Now you sometimes are recounting those elimination rounds. So one election could become functionally 3 or 4, and that means that there's a possibility that you might wind up asking for a recount in an early stage of the process, because if you eliminate, for instance, candidate A instead of candidate C, then candidate D wins instead of candidate B. So there's a new set of incentives to demand recounts and litigation, and that process also becomes extremely difficult. Post-election audits are also made more complex, whether we're talking about full process reviews or whether we're talking about risk-limiting audits. The central thesis of a risk-limiting audit is that you can save time by just counting a few votes, a small percentage of the votes. But keep in mind that with ranked choice voting, again, it's not just the end result, it's also the order of elimination. So this also is made more challenging with ranked choice voting. There are a huge number of questions that come with RCV, questions that will ultimately have to be resolved either with expansive legislation or with a variety of new rules. I've seen some of the regulatory documents in places that have gone to ranked choice voting. I have read some of the documents from voting system vendors that talk about all of the different things that you have to code for with RCV. There is an extensive amount of rulemaking that comes with changing your system to an RCV system because it is a fundamentally different type of election. And ballot design is extremely difficult as well. You saw the sample ballot that Alaska prepared. Now you've got to go through that for every race. So you're giving a ballot to voters that may have 60, 80, or 100 bubbles to fill in. You've got to give people, you've got to design that in a way that's not going to confuse people overly, although I think there's really no way to avoid some level of confusion. My colleague Trent England's going to talk about some of that in terms of the impact on voters when it comes to mistakes that lead to ballots being rejected. But nevertheless, you have some significant challenges. Ballots are lengthier. They take more time to fill out. So these are all the problems that make ranked choice voting so difficult to administer and, frankly, make it harder to vote in a ranked choice election. Now, this is what it looks like to tabulate a ranked choice election. Now, this was a multi-candidate race, which is why you see 2 declared winners, and I apologize, the numbers are a little bit small. But again, instead of essentially reporting results in a single column with all of the candidates and then their vote totals, now you're going to have that process of elimination, and this is what this looks like. This is the tabulation from Arlington County, Virginia, when they first used ranked choice voting. Again, they used it in a primary, but it was functionally the election. And they were trying to establish 2 winners. So you had 6 candidates. Because of limitations to the voting equipment, voters were only allowed to rank 3 of them. So it's one extra layer of complexity from the voters' perspective. And then you were identifying 2 winners. And I wanted to show this first because it illustrates how complex this is. The average voter looking at this is not necessarily going to understand how it is that you got to the final results. The other point that I wanted to make with this, and again, I apologize, the numbers are a little small. If you see in round 1, because you've got 6 candidates vying for the vote, the main candidates, the top 4 vote getters, all got almost the same number of votes. And yet by the end, the 2 winners had inflated their percentages from 23% to 40% and from 25% to 60%. Ranked choice voting promises that it will identify candidates who get majority support. But what it really does is manufacture that majority. If you look at the first round totals, who voters actually wanted in office, there's almost no distinction. And there's a split where almost 1 in 4 voters picked one of those top 4 candidates. And yet by the end, one of them was able to claim a 60% mandate. This is the shell game that ranked choice voting is ultimately playing. The complexity that we've talked about leads to, unfortunately, errors that are possible within ranked choice voting, and sometimes those errors can go undetected and could have profound impacts on the results of elections. In fact, in Oakland, California, in 2022, in California they used ranked choice voting for some local races. There was a problem. Several hundred voters got their ranked choice ballots and they did not rank anybody in first place. We don't know whether that was because they were confused or because they were protest voting, but nevertheless they did not. Now the protocol was to count those votes, but to simply shift and pretend that the second place vote was the first place vote. But the tabulators in Oakland programmed the equipment incorrectly and they threw those ballots out. And then they ran the numbers, they certified the results, and they declared it turned out the wrong winner in one of the elections. It was not until 2 months after the election and after certification that the mistake had been identified. It was identified by an outside group of ranked choice experts that came in and reran the numbers and identified the problem. But it required ultimately a lawsuit and an additional 2 months to resolve this issue. And again, if it hadn't been for that outside audit, it is possible that this mistake would have gone undetected, and somebody who did not properly win an election would have been seated in this particular race. This is one of the fundamental problems, and it gets back to what I mentioned at the beginning about the lack of transparency. It is difficult for voters to understand. It is unfortunately difficult for election officials to understand as well. And one of the most important things from a voter confidence perspective is that voters can understand the system and that it is transparent. Ranked choice voting undermines that. It is also expensive. One of the signature promises of ranked choice voting is that it is less expensive than running a traditional runoff. But when you compare an election that doesn't already have a runoff with the cost savings from one that does, that's a little bit of an apples to oranges comparison. And frankly, when it comes to ranked choice voting, the proponents usually gloss over the extraordinary costs. So New York City, for instance, ran a $15 million voter education program in 2021 when they first used ranked choice voting. That was the expense that it required to explain to New York voters how to vote in ranked choice voting. And now today, here we sit going through their second ranked choice election, and the sheer number of articles that have been written in news outlets that have come from the city trying to explain this process strongly suggests to me that there is still a lot of uncertainty and confusion about how this actually works. In the state of Maine, they produced a 19-page voter guide explaining ranked choice voting when they shifted to elections, to ranked choice elections. There is an extraordinary front-end cost here, not to mention the cost of retraining election officials, retraining poll workers with this new process. All of these costs are front-end costs before any of the promised cost savings materialize. And again, if you're talking about an election where you are not already doing a runoff, those cost savings are not going to be there. There's also the potential need to purchase either new voting equipment or new software, because again, you've got multiple vendors that need to report in a consistent format. They do not do that. So now at a minimum, you almost certainly have to purchase third-party software to layer over your existing reporting to make sure that you can get results. So these are all costs that seldom get talked about in this debate. We also hear a lot of claims about how ranked choice voting will lead to higher turnout in the elections. But what we've seen in terms of the data is that this is false. When Alaska shifted to ranked choice voting, they actually had the lowest turnout election in state history. There have been studies that have been conducted that the complexity of ranked choice voting actually winds up deterring particularly low propensity voters. These are voters that we typically try to do a lot of work to bring into the democratic process. They're being turned off by ranked choice voting. They don't understand it. They don't think that their vote matters. They are not voting. You see a negative effect. This was also documented by an MIT study that found that there was at best a neutral effect on voter turnout, and that there are many, many examples of races where turnout decreased. We also see promises that we're going to wind up with typically more moderate candidates and less negative campaigning, but here again the data says otherwise. An MIT study of Maine in their first ranked choice voting election found more negative advertisements and more out-of-state dark money coming in to impact that election after they switched to ranked choice voting than before. We've also seen absolutely no indication that you wind up with more moderate candidates getting elected. There was a study that was conducted by the Hubert Humphrey School in the University of Minnesota that found that it does not lead to more diverse candidates getting elected, and it does not seem to have any impact in terms of moderating politics. What we're seeing right now in New York City also is an example of this. One of the two front runners is a Democratic Socialist, and whether you are in favor of or oppose that particular program, I don't think anybody would call that moderate, and yet there have been countless articles talking about how progressives are staking their hopes on ranked choice voting. So there is yet another data point that strongly suggests that this does not deliver either less negative campaigning or more moderate candidates. So with that, I will turn it over to my colleague Trent England to continue to walk through some of the history of ranked choice voting and some of the impacts on voters. And then at the end, we're happy to take questions if there are any, but thank you for the time.
There we go. Thank you, Jason. Thank you, Madam Chair and members of the committee. I'll start with the bottom line. Ranked choice voting makes voting harder. It makes voting harder for voters. It makes administering elections harder for clerks. and it makes it harder to tabulate and report and understand the results. At every step of the way, ranked choice voting makes the election process more difficult. One of the ways that we see this, just to elaborate on what Jason was mentioning, there's an election in New York, obviously tomorrow, in New York City. The primary, they have had ranked choice voting now for a while. People have, most of the people voting tomorrow likely have used this process at least once before. And yet you can go online, you can find a slew of articles in all of the New York City media explaining to people how to use this, right? Which is a great tell. Whether people support it or oppose it or don't really care about the election system, everyone understands that ranked choice voting is harder to understand, and they're trying to explain it right now to voters in New York City. One of the things that they found after they used it 4 years ago was a tremendous disparate impact against racial minorities. And this is something we in the election space see in all kinds of litigation, all kinds of political debates about various election changes, is questions about disparate impact on particular groups of voters. And one of the things that the folks pushing ranked choice voting do is they'll produce opinion polls. This is how they try to rebut these arguments, is they say produce opinion polls that they've paid for that say, no, when you go out and ask voters, are you smart enough to use this election system? Voters say, of course I'm smart enough to use this election system, right? You produce an opinion poll that asks people how smart they are. They generally think that they're above average, right? Which is fine. That's human nature. But when you look at the actual data, which we can do from New York City 4 years ago, you find that black voters, for example, were 2.5 times less likely to rank candidates, which makes them 2.5 times more likely to have their ballots exhausted and thrown out. I mean, that's a disparate impact that goes beyond anything I've ever seen argued in a court case over election policies. And I'm, if you've been on this committee for any length of time, I'm sure you've debated issues that have been involved in lawsuits. I've never heard of anything like that. You might hear, 2.5%, right? But 2.5 times, that is a tremendous disparate impact that ranked choice voting had in New York City that I think deserves to get more attention. We see ranked choice voting used in just 2 states, as Jason mentioned. They're 2 of the smaller states. It's also revealing, I think, that in both of those situations, ranked choice voting was put into effect for very specific political reasons that are well understood. This isn't conspiracy theory stuff, right? In Alaska, they have ranked choice voting because Republican moderate Senator Lisa Murkowski wanted an open primary. She knew that if she had to run in the Republican primary, she would lose that primary. She wanted an open primary, and she wanted that primary to produce more than 2 winners because she might not come out of even an open primary that only had 2 winners. So they adopted a top 4 open primary system, which allowed her to be one of the 4 candidates to proceed to the general election. When you use a top 4 system, then they want ranked choice voting at the end of that process to try to consolidate that support in the way that Jason talked about. And so the entire reason why Alaska uses this system is just political. The machine behind Lisa Murkowski wanted this system so that she could stay in office. They got the system, she stayed in office. In Maine, Paul LePage won the office of governor because the Democrat Party coalition had splintered and produced some independent candidates running for governor and for some other offices in Maine that had made it easier for Republicans to win at the statewide level. So the Democrats wanted to use ranked choice voting in those elections because they thought that it would help them win elections, and it did help them win elections. Actually, in both states, one of the ancillary effects was to flip a congressional seat. But it's interesting to me that we see this adopted really for political reasons, right? Despite all of the high-minded rhetoric around ranked choice voting. How would this affect the state of Michigan? One of the things that is interesting about Michigan is, as I look at states around the country, you have a uniquely decentralized election system. You have a lot of local control on elections. I think this is a great strength. There's obviously 2 sides to that coin, and I know that you all deal with with some of the challenges around that as well. But as Jason mentioned, with ranked choice voting, all of the data has to be consolidated before the tabulation process can be begun. And that, for statewide races in Michigan, would mean all of the data statewide would have to be centralized before you can begin this tabulation process. There's two ways to do that. One way is to have computer systems that communicate very effectively from the clerks up to the state level. I hear that you've had some trouble with the state election officials implementing other computer systems lately. But you would either rely on having a system where the data can move from the clerks to the state level seamlessly and in a way that people trust before that tabulation would begin, or in some places they move all of the physical ballots. In Alaska, my understanding is that they centralize all of the physical ballots before they begin this counting. So you're talking about 3 million ballots, probably multi-page ballots that would have to be brought together, or all of that data extracted and brought together to run ranked choice voting tabulation in the state of Michigan. One of, I think, the biggest questions about how that would work is in the case of recounts, and particularly hand recounts. You do hand recounts in some instances in the state of Michigan. There has never, as far as I can find in any of the research about ranked choice voting, any of the election results, there's never been a recount with ranked choice voting in an election where you have millions of ballots, right? I mean, typically this is used in municipal elections. You're talking about maybe, thousands of ballots, in some cases just hundreds of ballots, right? In Michigan, before anyone should consider ranked choice voting at the state level, the question has to be answered, how would it work to do a hand recount if you had a closed statewide election? Because I actually don't think there's an answer to that question. One of the other interesting complexities about Michigan that I noticed in, obviously there's a ballot measure that's been filed here pushing this. You all have straight ticket voting, something that many states don't have. And the ballot measure, at least, attempts to keep straight ticket voting and allow people to rank parties and then also rank candidates in a way that makes ranked choice voting even more complicated, which is fascinating. That's another wrinkle in Michigan that I've never seen attempted anywhere else, where they use or even have just proposed ranked choice voting. I want to talk a little bit about before I wrap up, about the situation in Oakland that Jason also mentioned, because it's very telling. This was an election in 2022. We had already been working on ranked choice voting and raising some of the concerns that I think are natural with this system, that voters can become confused. It calls for all of this subjective rulemaking, and that means that rulemaking has to be implemented in the tabulation process, in all of that technology that's relied on by ranked choice voting, and that would seem to diminish the transparency. We had made all of these observations, and then all of these things came to pass in this election in Oakland, California, which, as I mentioned, most of these ranked choice elections are actually, this isn't a statewide election, right? This is an Oakland school board election. There were about 26,000 ballots involved in this, right? So this is a mid-sized municipal election, 26,000 ballots. And 235 voters are confused, or as Jason said, maybe they're protesting. They say, nobody's my first choice, but I do have a second choice. Whatever happened, you get 235 ballots that are filled out incorrectly. What do you do when somebody doesn't rank someone first but does rank someone second? That's a subjective question for rulemakers that doesn't exist in regular elections. Regular election is a simple addition problem. 1 vote plus 1 vote plus one vote, right? That's it doesn't create a lot of wiggle room for regulators to make decisions. In this case, you have to make a decision. What do you do? And the options are, you could say, well, it's just an undervote. Maybe we don't count those at all. The voters were confused in this race. Or you could say, we're just going to skip it in round 1, and we'll come back to it in round 2. They ranked someone in round 2, so we'll come back to this ballot in round 2. That is how the computers in Alameda County were programmed, but the rule said you compress the rankings. If you have if you have a ballot where someone was ranked 2nd and 4th, that becomes a 1st and 2nd ranking, and the computer has to suck that data in, compress those rankings before the tabulation begins. That's what's supposed to happen in Alameda County, but they use this other rule, this rule that you just ignore those 235 ballots in the first round. And nobody noticed. All of their ranked choice voting results were off. It only flipped the result in this one school board race, but all of the ranked choice voting elections that they had to rerun the numbers in January and re-release the data from that election. In the first round, so there were three candidates, Resnick, Manigo, I believe, and Hutchinson were the three candidates there. And the candidates coming in second and third, Manigo and Hutchinson, were very, very close. Those 235 ballots made the difference. When they were run under one set of rules, Manigo was ahead by 41 votes. When you ran those ballots under the correct set of rules, Hutchinson was ahead by 37 votes. But what that means is under their first attempt at this election, Hutchinson is dropped out, right? He's 41 votes behind the candidate who came in second. So Hutchinson gets dropped out of that election. His votes are redistributed, and Resnick goes on to win the election. And it looks like it's a clear victory, right? It's not even close in that final round. The problem is that actually it was supposed to be Manigo who dropped out and Hutchinson who continued. And when you do that, most of the voters for Manigo supported Hutchinson. And so the candidate who was eliminated, when the rule was just slightly different, I mean, and again, you could decide that that's the right way to do it. Just ignore those ballots in the first round. There's nothing wrong with that. That's why the software allowed for that option. But instead, Hutchinson goes from being eliminated in the first round to winning the school board seat. It just takes him 4 months, and it takes this pure coincidence that some scholars had decided to look at that election data. They were just doing other kinds of research. They weren't auditing the election. But when they reran the data, they were able to tell that there was a discrepancy. I mean, the voters were confused. The election administrators were confused or made a mistake. Both of those mistakes only possible in ranked choice voting, right? I mean, you can't. Those mistakes just literally aren't possible in an ordinary election process. They're made possible by ranked choice voting, and the lack of transparency, partly because the system is so technology dependent, and partly because it's just not intuitive, right? A regular election, you're adding up votes. We all, everybody in this room, right? You look at election data, all the time, or at least every couple of years, and it's not that hard to look at some data and say, this seems off, or there's something about this, or this is just very close, right? In these ranked choice voting elections, especially when you just look at the final data, it may look like it was a landslide, while somewhere back in those rounds of tabulation, there's a very close election coming down to just in this case, about 70 vote switch. That completely changes who has that manufactured majority. One of the other things to notice about that election in Oakland, because it's common across ranked choice voting elections that go through multiple rounds of tabulation, is that the final results made it look like Hutchinson won with 50.1% of the votes. In that case, it was very close in the final round. So that's the manufactured majority. But that's after about 1,500 ballots were thrown out between round 1 and round 2. Hutchinson didn't really have a majority. And scholars have found, as they've looked at ranked choice voting elections that go through multiple rounds of tabulation, that is typical. That's actually overwhelmingly the case, that the final winner, if you keep the denominator based on everybody who turned out in that election, everybody who cast a valid vote in that election, even if their ballots are later exhausted in the rounds of ranked choice voting, typically the winner doesn't actually have a majority. And that just makes sense, because you are in every round, right? You have some ballots that get exhausted, some voters who are eliminated, and the folks who advocate for ranked choice voting talk about it like it just has to be this way. We just have to set these ballots aside. We can't count them for losing candidates. Think about it. That's not true. That's just marketing. Ranked choice voting is designed this way for marketing purposes. It eliminates voters from an election for marketing purposes, so they can claim that it produces a majority. They just don't count people who voted for losing candidates. I mean, you could take Michigan's election system right now and guarantee a majority winner if you get to throw away all of the voters who voted for other than the top 2 candidates. That's just math, right? But really, it's just marketing. And we wouldn't consider that a legitimate way to run elections in Michigan right now. You say, well, there were 3 candidates in this race. Whoever came in third, we just eliminate them. Eliminate all that person's voters, and you can guarantee that one of the other 2 candidates will have a majority. I find it really outrageous that ranked choice voting was designed this way and gets implemented this way, to eliminate voters so that it can appear that it produces a majority. For all these reasons, ranked choice voting is becoming much less popular. And we've actually seen this in history before. This is a system that seems new because it has failed in the past. Ranked choice voting was actually invented in Victorian England. It was pushed there, was not adopted. It's not used in England. It is used in some elections in Ireland and Australia, but otherwise didn't really take off. It came to the U.S. There was a push for ranked choice voting in the U.S. early in the 20th century. It was adopted by, I think, around 40 cities here, and they all got rid of it. Some of them after just 1 or 2 elections. This is a system that's actually been used before. It only seems new because all the places that tried it earlier in the last century got rid of it. So we haven't heard of it before, right, until people more recently have started pushing this system and have gotten some traction because I think there's a lot of frustration. There's a lot of legitimate frustration about our politics today. But as Jason went through, the claims that they make for ranked choice voting just don't come to pass, right? It does not actually improve American politics in the way that advocates claim. Utah adopted a pilot program allowing local governments to use ranked choice voting several years ago, and they had pretty good uptake on this. They had 24 jurisdictions that tried ranked choice voting. That now has dropped down to 4. So 20 jurisdictions tried it, got rid of it. That will drop to 0 next year because that pilot program is going to be allowed to expire. I used to live in Pierce County, Washington, in Washington State. They adopted ranked choice voting, used it in a single election, and overwhelmingly by a vote of the people got rid of it. So that has been a frequent occurrence with ranked choice voting. As Jason said, 17 states, probably by the end of this year it will be 18, have banned ranked choice voting. Because they've looked at it and they have determined that this is just not the right answer for elections, to make voting harder for voters, to make the process harder for the people who run elections, to make the whole system harder to understand. So with that, I think we're both glad to take any questions.
Thank you, Mr. England and Snead, for being here and providing a very informative breakdown of how ranked choice voting works and the system. It is extremely confusing to me, even as a former clerk, makes my head just kind of think, this is to fundamentally change our whole election process in this manner would be so confusing to the voters, the clerks, election officials who conduct and run training people. So I am very much in agreement with you on that. I do have a question. Also, just thinking firsthand, when my son just voted for the very first time, I mean, first-time voters, young voters, I can't imagine them understanding how any of this works. And as you mentioned, 19 pages of how to explain the system and how to do that, that's not a way to get people to the polls to vote. One question I do have, information on how the ranked choice voting interacts with state or straight ticket, as Michigan has here. Do you have more information on that with other states that either have it that's existing? Do they have straight ticket voting? How would that even work here?
As far as I know, it's never been put together with straight ticket voting. I've never seen that. I never saw it until the ballot measure was filed here, and my understanding, reading their language, is that it assumes that you would have the qualified parties at the top of the ballot. You'd have the opportunity to rank them. And then you also could vote in races down the ballot, if I'm reading this language correctly. So if you left a race blank, your party ranking would be the default for that, would become the votes for that race. If you voted in a race, then that would override your straight ticket choice, which, if I'm understanding it right, I mean, I see what they're getting at, right? They want to keep, I think a lot of Michigan voters like straight ticket voting. They're trying to keep straight ticket voting. But when you think about that from a clerk's perspective, it might be easy to scan that into a computer, and the computer deals with it. If you ever have to hand recount those ballots, there literally are 2 places where a person may have voted in any of the races on that ballot. It's just another way where it becomes far more complicated for clerks. And anytime we're talking about scanning all this into a computer, we are talking about just trusting the computer to have been programmed correctly, the scanners to work correctly, because, as I mentioned before, it becomes very hard once you feed this data into the computer to make sure that everything is being done right from there.
If I may, Chair Smith, I think that straight ticket voting is generally antithetical to ranked choice voting. The whole purpose of recreating the system with RCV is to deliberately encourage voters not to do that and to rank multiple candidates. So I think the effect would be to disincentivize the use of straight ticket voting. And for anyone that does continue to use straight ticket voting, keep in mind the ballot exhaustion problem. If you only vote for one person in a race and that candidate is eliminated, your vote is also eliminated in that particular race. So I think there are several challenges to trying to combine ranked choice voting and straight ticket voting, and I think it's going to be, as Trent just said, I think it's going to be another layer of complexity for everybody, the voter and the clerks alike.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the one word that I think of is disenfranchisement at its finest. We will move on to further questions from committee members. Representative Kolazar.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you both for your testimony. I really do appreciate your perspective on this. I think with it potentially being on the ballot, it's important for Michigan voters to be educated on what ranked choice voting is. It's my hope, obviously you two are both against ranked choice voting. It's my hope, Madam Chair, that we will eventually hear somebody who's for it to get a full perspective and have a good, robust committee and good conversation on it. But one question I do want to ask, and again, I don't have the data, that's why I want to hear this from you. I often hear about ranked choice voting is that you would see more moderate candidates succeed, and you both said that is not the case. I guess when I just eyeball test this, though, when you think about who comes to a primary, oftentimes it's your most partisan of voters, right? We can go back and you can see that, and I know my constituents often get frustrated with the levels of partisanship they see in Lansing. So my question is, if let's say you had a diehard left or a diehard right candidate on either side of the aisle, but you had two moderate candidates that were also in the race, maybe if I'm one of the moderate candidates and I'm in dead last and I know I'm not winning, couldn't that encourage collaboration between me and second place to maybe defeat the most partisan of candidates? That's my question. Couldn't that foster collaboration between more moderate-minded candidates to defeat the more partisan one? Just curious your take on that.
So the interesting thing about this whole question with ranked choice voting, it really depends on the mix of candidates, and it even depends on the personalities, right? And I think that's why it's you certainly you can have an environment where, because of the mix of candidates and because of their personalities, it's going to help somebody who's more moderate. What we see right now in New York City, arguably, and we'll find out, not really tomorrow, but maybe a few weeks after tomorrow, is an attempt by the more extreme candidates to do what you're talking about, right? And so I think a lot of the ranked choice voting advocates, right, they really honestly, earnestly think this is going to help moderates, and they see it that way, but they're sort of projecting, right? That's what they want to happen. They want it to work that way, and the reality is that, like any political technology or strategy, it can be employed by people on the extremes, it can be employed by people in the middle, and I just don't think there's any reason to think that ranked choice voting is going to favor, in a consistent way, favor people in the middle. And particularly the ballot proposal here, typically the argument that ranked choice voting proponents make is you should have this like open top 4, top 5 primary to try to get more of that dynamic by changing who makes it to the general. I mean, the proposal that's on the table in Michigan doesn't even do that, right? You just have ranked choice in the primaries, ranked choice in the general. So it is a little different than what's been tried in places other than Maine.
Representative Pavlo.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Trent and Jason. I think you might have answered part of my question. If a voter decides not to rank and just does the one person in each election, what happens to the ballot?
Yes, sir, Representative Pavlov. The question would really be, is the person who that voter is voting for, does that candidate make it all the way to the end or not? If the answer is yes, then the vote would be cast for the one person that they ranked. If the answer is no, and the candidate is eliminated at any point in this process, then their ballot is considered exhausted and eliminated as well.
All right, thank you.
Representative Fox.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you guys for being here. I just need to make clear on your map, so the vermilion was 22, 24 to 24, the scarlet is 25, and then what does the X stand for? Because I see X's on the vermilion states too.
Yes, Representative. The X's represent states that in November of last year rejected ranked choice voting ballot measures. There was a concerted effort and about $100 million that was spent on pro-ranked choice voting ballot measures nationwide, and these states all rejected them. In fact, there was not a single state that adopted a ranked choice voting ballot measure last year. And you can see that this is a fairly politically and ideologically diverse set of states. You've got red states, you've got blue states like Oregon, and you've got purple states like Arizona. And in each of these, those ballot measures were defeated by bipartisan majorities.
Okay, so that makes it easy for me to see, you know, with what you're presented, why it's been banned. I guess, you know, as a former algebra teacher, I never got taught the importance of changing the denominator. You know, I mean, that is just weird, okay? And the idea of some type of new math with this just does not make sense to me. So my question really is, would you argue for paper ballots and same-day results in our election system in the state of Michigan?
Sir, I generally say that hand-marked paper ballots are a good way to conduct an election. I'm in favor of electronic tabulation for the speed so that you can get election results as close to election night as possible. I'm a voter in the Commonwealth of Virginia. That's the way we do it with the Scantron-style system, and it works very well. And it's always good when you get to the point where you need to do recounts, where you need to adjudicate ballots, to have something that the voter actually marked with their own hand. That, of course, becomes far more complicated with ranked choice voting, and the ballots themselves become longer no matter how you do it. The amount of time it takes to fill out a ranked choice ballot is lengthier as well, and there are ripple effects to all of that.
Yeah. Well, and as a former teacher, I really appreciated Scantrons. So thank you very much.
Representative Wooden.
No surprise, Madam Chair. I was more of a long essay fan myself, but thank you again for coming in and giving your testimony. And I would echo the comments of my colleague, because I myself am not convinced either way on this. I certainly think you've brought up some valid concerns, but I do think, given this will be on the ballot, it may make sense to bring supporters to give a point versus counterpoint. But one question I did, one point you brought up that I think makes a great deal of sense is we have a very long ballot here in Michigan. I mean, I don't know many states that elect their drain commissioner. And many of the countries that have maintained ranked choice voting have smaller ballots. Oftentimes they're parliamentary systems, so they're not even electing their national executive. They're electing their member of parliament, their local or provincial councilor, et cetera. And so the voter management process that you've talked about is mitigated that way. That being said, our primaries, at least, often mimic that. Our primary ballot in the upcoming election is going to have, as I count on my paper, I believe 5 to a dozen, depending on if there's a special election or not, or 5 to half a dozen, 5 to 6. That to me seems like a much smaller ballot, and many of our primary elections, oftentimes the winner of a crowded primary can win with 20% of the vote. And that person could, even with our new redistricting methods, oftentimes our districts are biased one way or another because of our geographic concentration of voters. That to me seems like enough of a problem where wouldn't ranked choice voting at least ensure that someone who emerges from a primary can claim a stronger, if not a outright majority of everyone who voted, a stronger mandate than someone who wins a primary with 25% of the vote?
Representative Wooden, I appreciate the question. I think the answer is yes, they could claim that. The question is it true? I think you saw, and in fact, I can pull it up here in my chart. When you look at the way that ranked choice voting works, it inflates the apparent margin of victory. So you'll often see in the first round a very narrow spread between the leading candidates in a race. To your point, a candidate may win with 20 or 30% in a really crowded field. And by the end, in this particular example, one of the winners was able to claim a 60% victory. But if you're counting second and third place votes to get there, does that actually reflect that voter really wants that person? Depending on how many rankings you allow, at some point, I think it's inarguable that you're going to either get to a point where you're going from genuine support to, at best, I don't care about this person, to at worst, I'm actually trying to signal that I oppose this person by ranking them in fourth or fifth. And then there's also the question of, once you get past the first couple of rankings, how much of this is random data? Because there's a lot of names that voters don't recognize. And, you mentioned how long ballots are. So now, you're trying to vote in, 6th or 8th or the 10th race of the day. You've got to get back to pick up your kids and take them to soccer practice, so you're just ranking to get it done. So you can claim that you have a mandate or you even have a majority. But I think when you add in all of that and when you consider how many ballots are exhausted and eliminated, it's really questionable whether it's a genuine claim or not.
If I can just have a quick follow-up. No, and a valid point. I would just at least stress, because we have no reason absentee voting, early in-person voting, at least the timing considerations are mitigated that way as more and more Michiganders use those avenues to vote. But one thought that just came across my mind, oftentimes in primaries, at least I myself, as both an elected and a primary voter, have times felt like I actually do like multiple candidates and have difficulty narrowing down to one, especially in the presidential primaries. And we've seen, case in point, the longest running, by my view, ranked choice system was the caucuses in Iowa. Where, as a result, in those rooms, if someone didn't have viability, those votes could be reallocated, which did in turn create incentives for presidential candidates during the Iowa caucuses to have a more civil discourse between those campaigns, knowing that if someone doesn't have viability, they may very well move to their camp. We saw that in the 2008 Iowa caucuses. We certainly saw it in the 2016 and 2020 caucuses. So I would at least pose that we have seen that at least at the primary level. Just wondering whether or not, given oftentimes primary candidates or voters could have multiple preferences and maybe not dead set on one, whether it could be valuable in that instance.
Yeah, I think you make a really good point that primaries, that we shouldn't conflate primaries with general elections. I think a lot of election conversations do that. A true primary is doing something very different, right? And frankly, why I tend to favor things like like healthy, if you can have a healthy caucus convention system, right, where you really have people coming together to choose a candidate in a deliberative way. One of the other alternatives wouldn't, I think, work with your current election schedule, but I live and vote in Oklahoma these days, and we use a runoff in primaries, which does cost more money than having a second election rather than just having one. But it is a deliberative process, and I think sometimes the winner of that runoff is not the person who would have won under a ranked choice or first past the post system in a single primary, because you get this focused debate. You basically say, here's the top two most popular Democrats or top two most popular Republicans, and now we actually get to really find out who they are and make that informed choice. And it's the first state I've lived in and voted in that works that way, but I actually think it's a very healthy way for parties to nominate candidates.
Well, we have no further questions, and I would just like to thank you once again, Mr. England and Snead, for your very informative education on the ranked choice voting here. So appreciate your time. And there being no further business before the committee will stand adjourned.